So how does a kingdom, one that was built over 100 years of blood, sweat, and faith, just vanish? I mean, think about it. In July of 1187, the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem brought out one of the largest armies it had ever put together, and just 48 hours later, that army was completely gone. Its king was a prisoner, its most holy relic was captured, and the road to Jerusalem was wide open. This really isn't just a story about one battle. No, this is the story of how an entire empire was shattered in a single weekend. Now, at the heart of this whole story is one of history's most fascinating figures, Salah ad-Din, or as he's known in the West, Saladin. He was way more than just a brilliant general. He was a unifier who really felt he had a destiny to fulfill. This quote right here, it tells you so much about how he thought. He understood that this cycle of violence, especially the Crusader conquest a century before, had created a kind of debt. And that debt, well, it was eventually going to have to be paid in blood. For Saladin, this wasn't just another war. It was about setting things right. All right, to really get how this disaster happened, we've got to go back to the late 12th century. The Holy Land is basically a powder keg just waiting to explode. For decades, you've got the Crusader states and their Muslim neighbors living in this really tense, always shifting balance of power. But now, that balance is about to be completely shattered, forever. So what was the Kingdom of Jerusalem? Well, you can think of it as a European feudal state that was just kind of picked up and dropped into the Middle East. It was a serious military power, for sure, but it had this one fatal weakness: its location. It was like an island in a huge sea of Islamic territories. It was a Christian outpost that could really only survive as long as its enemies were divided. And by the 1180s, that just wasn't the case anymore. And this is exactly what made Saladin so incredibly dangerous. You see, where there used to be all these squabbling city-states and rival caliphates, Saladin had managed, through a mix of diplomacy and sheer force, to build a single, unified empire. It stretched all the way from North Africa to Mesopotamia. He now controlled the entire southern and eastern sides of the Crusader states, and he had fired up his people with a single, powerful rallying cry: jihad. And in this case, it meant a holy struggle, a war sanctioned by God to take back the sacred city of Jerusalem from Christian rule. But you know what Saladin's greatest advantage was? It wasn't his huge army or even his strategic genius. It was the fatal flaw right at the very heart of the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself. Its own leadership was tearing the place apart from the inside. The kingdom was basically split into two really bitter factions. On one side, you had the nobles faction, led by a guy named Raymond III of Tripoli. These were the old guard lords, guys who knew the local politics and thought it was smarter to use careful strategy and make truces with Saladin. But on the other side, you had the court faction. This was a group of newcomers and absolute hardliners who were close to the new king, Guy of Lusignan. This group included the reckless Raynald of Châtillon and the super zealous Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard de Ridefort. These guys were the elite warrior monks of the kingdom, and to them, any kind of compromise with Saladin was not just cowardly, it was a sin. And this contrast, this was the kingdom's fatal weakness. I mean, while the Crusader barons are locked in this paranoid Cold War, accusing each other of treason, Saladin's authority is absolute. He had united the entire Muslim world under one banner for one single purpose. The Crusaders? They couldn't even unify their own war council. It was going to take just one act of pure, unbelievable arrogance to light the fuse. One man, ignoring every single treaty and every single warning, would give Saladin the perfect excuse for the war he had been preparing for his entire life. And that man was Raynald of Châtillon. He was infamous for his brutality and for having zero respect for truces. In the winter of 1186, while an official peace treaty was in effect, Raynald did the unthinkable. He attacked a massive, incredibly wealthy Muslim caravan that was traveling from Cairo to Damascus, a caravan full of merchants and pilgrims heading to Mecca. He killed the guards, threw the travelers in prison, and stole everything. This was so much more than just breaking a treaty. By mocking the prophet himself, Raynald had just turned a political argument into a deeply personal and sacred mission for the entire Islamic world. When word of Raynald's attack and his blasphemous words got back to Saladin, the Sultan's response was ice-cold and crystal clear. He swore a solemn, public oath that he would execute Raynald personally. This wasn't just about territory anymore. Now it was a war of honor. And Saladin had just made personal vengeance a top priority.
So Saladin called up the largest army he had ever led. But he knew that the heavily armored Crusader knights were absolutely devastating in a straight-up fight. So he came up with a plan to avoid fighting them on their own terms. He was going to use a much more powerful weapon against them, the desert itself.
His strategy was just a masterpiece of simplicity and cruelty. It was a three-step plan. First, he'd set a trap, some bait so tempting that the Crusaders just couldn't ignore it. Second, he would lure their entire army into a waterless wasteland under the blazing July sun. And third, once they were exhausted and dying of thirst, he would surround them and completely annihilate them.
And here was the bait. On July 2nd, Saladin began to siege the city of Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee. Now, this was a brilliant psychological move. Why? Because the fortress belonged to Raymond of Tripoli, the leader of the other faction. And trapped inside was Raymond's own wife, Countess Esquiva. Saladin was basically daring King Guy. Are you just going to stand by and watch your rival city burn? Are you going to abandon a noble Christian lady to the enemy? And the bait was taken. That night, inside King Guy's tent, the fate of the entire kingdom was sealed. The decision they made in that council meeting would lead them straight into annihilation.
Raymond of Tripoli, even though it was his own wife trapped in the city, argued passionately to stay put. He knew it was a trap. He told the council, "Let Tiberias fall. Saladin can't hold it. We are safe right here, with plenty of water. To march now is suicide." But Gerard de Wrightfort and Raynald of Châtillon, they immediately accused him of being a coward and a traitor. And their poisoned words worked on the weak-willed King Guy, who overruled Raymond and gave the order. At dawn, the army marches to relieve Tiberias. And so they set out. The entire military strength of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, all on the line. We're talking about 20,000 soldiers, including 1,200 of the best heavy cavalry in the world. This was an all-in gamble. They had no reserves. They were committing every single last man they had. And they marched out from their secure camp with its plentiful springs and straight into a parched 15-mile stretch of arid hills, a landscape with no reliable source of water, under the full, brutal heat of a Galilean summer. That decision wasn't just a strategic mistake, it was a death warrant. The march was just pure agony. Saladin's horse archers swarmed them, never really engaging head-on, but just constantly firing arrows, forcing the infantry to stay in this tight, slow-moving defensive box. Saladin's men even set fire to the dry grass, blanketing the Crusaders in this thick, choking smoke that made their dry throats even worse. Men and their massive war horses, weighed down by all that armor, just started to collapse from heat stroke and dehydration. By nightfall, the Crusader army was completely trapped on this dry plateau near a twin-peaked hill called the Horns of Hattin. They were surrounded, they were exhausted, and they were tormented by thirst. The morning of July 4th didn't dawn on an army ready for battle. No, it dawned on a collection of men who were just desperate for a single drop of water. The battle that came next was a total slaughter. The Christian infantry just broke ranks, making a mad dash for the distant Sea of Galilee, and they were cut down. The knights made several desperate, heroic charges. Saladin's own 17-year-old son, who was watching from his brother's side, cheered when one of the Frankish charges was beaten back. But Saladin corrected him, pointing to the last pocket of resistance on the hill where King Guy's red tent still stood. He said, "Be quiet. We have not beaten them until that tent falls." A little while later, the tent was overrun, and it fell. Afterwards, Saladin's justice was swift. King Guy and Raynald were brought to his tent. The Sultan, honoring the customs of hospitality, offered Guy a cup of iced water, a clear sign that his life would be spared. But when Guy passed the cup to Raynald, Saladin stepped in, reminding everyone that this man was not under his protection. Then, making good on his oath, Saladin executed Raynald of Châtillon himself. He spared King Guy, famously saying, "Kings do not kill kings," but he ordered the execution of every captured Templar and Hospitaller Knight, the two great military orders, who he saw as the fanatical heart of the Crusader war machine. Hattin wasn't just a defeat, it was an apocalypse for the Crusader states. In one day, their entire field army was just erased. Their holiest relic, a piece of the true cross they believed was from Christ's own crucifixion, was captured. This was a catastrophic blow to Christian morale. With no soldiers left to defend the walls of their castles and cities, the kingdom just collapsed like a house of cards. Acre, Sidon, Beirut, Ascalon, they all fell within weeks. And by October, Saladin was standing right at the gates of Jerusalem itself. Look, the Battle of Hattin was an absolutely stunning military victory for Saladin. It's a testament to his brilliant strategy. But the seeds of that defeat, they were planted long before the battle, in the bitter rivalries and fatal pride of the Crusader leadership. And it leaves us with this final thought. Was the Kingdom of Jerusalem really conquered by Saladin's army, or did it just march itself out into the desert to die, a final tragic victim of its own arrogance?